At some point, you woke, and your hand reached for your phone. It felt like a choice made from somewhere inside you. Something wanted, something decided, and then the hand moved. Almost everyone believes the cause of that act lived within you. Burrhus Frederick Skinner spent 50 years arguing that this belief is wrong. Not that you lack thoughts or wants or the feeling of choosing. He granted all of that openly and without much fuss. His claim cut deeper, and it is far harder to dismiss. The real cause of your reaching, he said, lay outside you. It lay in a history of consequences your behavior had already met. This sounds absurd, and saying it plainly does not make it true. So this series will not ask you to take any of it on faith. We will rebuild Skinner's argument from the ground, one step at a time. You will see the problem that forced each idea into being. And you will see, at full strength, where his critics struck back. By the end, you can decide for yourself whether he was right. The stakes are larger than one man's theory of rats and pigeons. If Skinner was right, much of ordinary life rests on a mistake. How we praise and blame, punish and reward one another. How we explain our own choices and judge the choices of others. But before any of that, there is a prior question to settle. For centuries we studied the mind by looking directly inside it. That method collapsed, and how it collapsed is where we begin. Part 1. The Unreliable Witness. The most natural way to study a mind is to ask it about itself. You have direct access to your own thoughts in a way no one else does. No instrument sits closer to your feelings than you do. So the founders of scientific psychology built their method on that closeness. They trained people to look inward and report what they found. This method was called introspection, the careful inspection of one's own experience. In the late 19th century, it was the cutting edge of a new science. Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig in 1879. His student Edward Titchener carried the program to Cornell in America. Their school was called structuralism because it mapped the structure of experience. They wanted to break consciousness into its parts, the way chemistry breaks matter. The procedure was demanding, and on the surface it looked rigorous. A trained observer received a stimulus, a tone, a colour, a word. Then the observer reported every sensation and image that passed through awareness. A rival group in Germany, the Würzburg School, pushed the method further. They gave subjects a hard problem or a dense aphorism to consider. Afterward, the subjects reported what their thinking had actually contained. And at this point, the whole project began to break apart. The Würzburg observers reported thoughts that contained no images at all. A pure grasp of a relation with nothing sensory attached to it. They called these imageless thoughts and insisted the reports were accurate. Titchener's laboratory examined the same kind of thinking and found the opposite. His trained observers always found a faint image or a bodily sensation underneath. There was no thought, they reported, without some sensory thread. Two expert groups examining the same thing reach flatly contradictory results. Now consider what it would take to settle that disagreement. In any mature science, you return to the evidence and look again. But the evidence here lived inside each observer, sealed off from everyone else. No third party could enter a Würzburg mind and check the report. Each lab's observers had been trained by a teacher who expected certain results, and reliably they produced the results their training had prepared them to see. The data were private, and private data cannot be checked by anyone. There was a deeper trap in the method, beyond mere disagreement. When two observers clashed, each could blame the other's training. The losing report was simply called the product of a poorly trained eye, so the method could absorb any result and never be proven wrong. A method that cannot fail also cannot teach you anything new. A science needs observations that two people can share and dispute. Introspection offered reports that no one but the reporter could confirm. In 1913, a young American named John Watson drew the radical conclusion: if the inner world cannot be observed publicly, drop it from the science. Study only what anyone can see, namely behavior, what organisms actually do. Psychology, Watson declared, is the science of behavior, not of the mind. This was not just a retreat forced by weak technology. Later evidence suggests the inner witness is unreliable in a deeper way. In 1977, the psychologists Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson reviewed many studies. People confidently explained why they had chosen, judged, or felt as they did. Yet their explanations often missed the actual cause the experiment had planted. They were not lying, they simply had no access to the real cause. They reported a plausible story, and mistook the story for a memory. A striking experiment published in 2005 pushed the point even further. Researchers showed people two faces and asked which one they found more attractive. Then, by sleight of hand, they returned the face the person had rejected. Most people failed to notice that the photographs had been swapped. And then they explained in detail why they preferred the face they had rejected. The reasons came easily, even when the choice itself was an illusion. So the move to behavior was not mere stubbornness about the unseen. It rested on a real and recurring failure of self-knowledge. But Watson's own behaviorism carried a flaw that would soon undo it. He modelled all behaviour on the reflex, the response pulled out by a stimulus. A bright light strikes the eye and the pupil contracts. A tap below the knee and the leg kicks. In every case, a prior event triggers the response that follows. This explains a sneeze, but almost nothing you would call an action. Think of the simplest voluntary act, a rat pressing a small lever. No stimulus reaches in and yanks the lever press out of the animal. The rat is not reacting to anything we can point to beforehand. The behaviour simply appears, sent out into the world on its own. A reflex psychology has no room for behaviour with no triggering cause. Yet that kind of behaviour is nearly everything we do. Walking, speaking, working, choosing, none of it waits for a push. If nothing in front of the behaviour causes it, then what does? Part 2. The Reversal of Cause. We ended with a rat pressing a lever for no visible reason. The common explanation reaches backward in time for a cause. Something must have come before the act and produced it. A desire, an intention, a signal, some push from behind. We assume the cause of any action must come before it. Skinner's central move was to look in the other direction entirely. The event that controls an action, he argued, comes after it. Not the cause behind the behaviour, but the consequence it produces. Press the lever and a pellet of food drops into the tray. Do this once, and pressing grows more likely in the future. The consequence reaches back and strengthens the very act that caused it. This sounds impossible, and the impossibility is worth facing directly. A consequence happens after the act, so it cannot cause that act. The future does not reach back and pull the present into being. Skinner's answer is that no single act is being explained at all. What we explain is the rising probability of a kind of behaviour. Each past press that produced food made the next press more likely. The control runs not from the future, but from a history of effects. Skinner gave this kind of behaviour a name, the operant. An operant is behaviour that operates on the world to produce effects. He set it against the reflex, which he called respondent behaviour. Pavlov's dogs salivating at a bell are responding, pulled by a stimulus. A rat pressing a lever for food is operating, sending behaviour out. The reflex is drawn out from the front, the operant selected from behind. The seed of this idea came from Edward Thorndike decades earlier. He put hungry cats in puzzle boxes they had to escape. A cat clawed and pushed until it tripped the latch by accident. Freed and fed, it was placed back in the box again. Across repeated trials, the useless movements faded and the latch came faster. Thorndike called this the law of effect, his great contribution. Acts followed by satisfaction, he said, are stamped into the animal. Skinner kept the law of effect, but removed one word from it. He struck out satisfaction, because no one can observe a cat's satisfaction. To say the cat felt satisfied only restates that it kept escaping. So he defined the key idea purely by its effect on behaviour. A reinforcer is any consequence that makes the behaviour before it more likely. Not what feels good, not what satisfies, only what raises the rate. This definition seems like a small change, but it overturns ordinary thinking. We assume rewards are pleasant and punishments unpleasant by their very nature. Skinner's definition says a thing is a reinforcer only if it works. Consider a child who screams in the middle of a grocery store. A parent rushes over, scolding, pleading, giving the child full attention. The scolding feels like punishment, and it is meant as punishment. Yet the screaming grows more frequent in the weeks that follow. By Skinner's test, the attention was a reinforcer, whatever it felt like. The label depends on the effect, never on how the consequence feels. To study this with precision, Skinner built a controlled little world. It became known as the Skinner box, though he disliked the name. Inside sat a lever, a food tray, and very little else. Strip away distraction, and one clean measure remains, the rate of responding. How often does the animal press, minute by minute, hour by hour? A pen on a slow drum traced each press as a rising line. Faster pressing tilted the line steeply, slow pressing kept it nearly flat. Behavior had become something you could measure and watch change over time. Notice what this whole picture of behavior quietly leaves out. There is no inner agent choosing, no will deciding, no self-steering. There is behavior, there is consequence, and there is a changing probability. The rat does not press because it wants the food. It presses because pressing has been followed by food before. Wanting, in this account, is not the cause, but another name for the pattern. But this raises a hard problem the theory must answer. Reinforcement can only strengthen behavior that already happens to occur. You cannot reward a lever press until the rat presses the lever once. Yet animals and people do things that have never occurred before. A pigeon does not naturally bowl, and no child is born speaking. If consequences only select what already happens, novelty becomes a mystery. Where does brand new behavior come from, the kind no past could have shaped? The answer turned out to be the most powerful tool Skinner ever found. Part 3. Where new behavior comes from. The answer arrived during the Second World War, in an odd place. In 1940, Skinner watched a flock of pigeons wheel beside his train. He saw them not as birds, but as small, agile guidance devices. Could a pigeon steer a missile toward a target by sight? The military funded the strange idea, and Skinner set to work. His plan put a trained pigeon inside the nose of a bomb. The bird faced a screen showing the scene below the falling bomb. Trained to peck at the target, it pecked at the target's image. Each peck nudged the controls and kept the bomb on its path. Skinner even used 3 pigeons together to outvote any single mistake. The weapon was never used, but the laboratory work changed everything. Working in a flour mill, Skinner and his assistants tried an experiment. They wanted to teach a pigeon to push a wooden ball, like bowling. Waiting for the bird to bowl on its own would take forever. A pigeon left alone will almost never swipe a ball with its beak. So they changed the rule and stopped waiting for the finished act. They reinforced anything that pointed, even faintly, in the right direction. First, they gave food whenever the bird merely turned toward the ball. Turning toward the ball quickly became frequent, so they raised the bar. Now only a step toward the ball earned the food, then only a touch, then only a push, then a real swipe. Within minutes, the ball was caroming off the walls of the box. One assistant was so amazed he left the field to train animals for a living. Skinner named this method shaping, and it rests on a simple ratchet. Shaping is the reinforcing of successive approximations to a target behavior. The form of a behavior, its shape in space and time, is its topography. Complex behavior has a complex topography that almost never appears all at once. Shaping builds that topography in steps, each one closer to the goal. This is the answer to where new behavior comes from. You never need the final act to occur by chance. You take whatever the animal already does and select its best version. Reinforcing the best version shifts the whole range of behavior toward it. Then yesterday's best becomes today's baseline, and you select again. Behavior is not pulled from nothing. It is sculpted from variation. A sculptor does not wait for marble to fall into the shape of a face. She removes what is wrong step by step until the face appears. Shaping depends on a feature of behavior most accounts overlook. Behavior is never perfectly uniform. It varies from moment to moment. Two lever presses are never quite identical in force or angle or speed. That natural variation is the raw material shaping works upon. Without variety to select from, there would be nothing to refine. Selection always needs variation to work on, or it has nothing to do. Shaping left the laboratory and quietly built an entire profession. The assistant who quit, Keller Brayland, began training animals commercially. He and Marion Breland shaped thousands of animals for shows and films. Every dolphin that leaps on cue has been shaped, approximation by approximation. The trainer's clicker marks the exact instant a movement earns its reward. A guide dog, a sniffer dog, a service animal, all shaped this way. The same method later became a way of teaching people, which comes later. Shaping explains how behavior is built, but not how it lasts. Once the pigeon bowls, what keeps it bowling day after day? If every press were always rewarded, the answer would seem obvious. But Skinner noticed something strange when reward came, only sometimes. Behavior that is rewarded now and then becomes weirdly hard to stop. It can persist for hours after the rewards have completely ended. Why would less reward produce more stubborn, more persistent behavior? Part 4. The schedules that capture us. A schedule of reinforcement is the rule that decides when reward comes. Reward every press, or every 10th press, or every few minutes. These rules might sound like trivial bookkeeping inside an experiment. They turned out to control the rhythm of behavior with astonishing precision. Skinner and Charles Foerster spent years mapping how each rule shapes action. The rules divide along two simple lines, and the lines matter. Reward can depend on how many times you act, called a ratio schedule. Or it can depend on time passing, called an interval schedule. And each can be fixed and predictable, or variable and unpredictable. Those two choices produce 4 basic patterns, each with its own signature. On a fixed ratio, reward comes after a set number of responses. Pay a worker for every 10 pieces and output runs fast and steady. But just after each payment comes a brief pause, a small rest. On a fixed interval, reward comes for the first response after a set time. Here, behavior sags right after reward, then climbs as the deadline nears. It is the rhythm of a student who studies hardest just before the exam. The variable schedules are where the most relentless behavior appears. On a variable ratio, reward comes after an unpredictable number of responses. Sometimes the 3rd press pays, sometimes the 50th, with no way to know. This produces the highest and steadiest response rate of any schedule. And it resists extinction far more stubbornly than any other arrangement. Extinction is what happens when reward stops and behavior slowly fades. Under steady reward, behavior fades fast once the reward disappears. The reason behind this is almost cruel in its logic. If reward always came, its absence is obvious the moment it stops. One unrewarded press, and the animal knows the world has changed. But under unpredictable reward, long dry spells are completely normal. The animal has pressed many times without reward before, then hit the payoff. So when reward truly ends, nothing tells the animal it has ended. Unpredictability builds a behavior that can no longer tell hope from delusion. One machine is built on exactly this principle, and you already know it. A slot machine pays on a variable ratio schedule by careful design. The next pull might pay, or the next, or the 100th. That is the schedule that produces the fastest, most durable responding. The machine is not exploiting a flaw in weak people, but a law of behavior. The anthropologist Natasha Dow-Schul spent 15 years studying these machines. She lived among gamblers and designers in Las Vegas to learn the craft. The heavy gamblers, she found, were often not playing to win. They played to reach a state they called the machine zone. In the zone, time, money, and the body itself fall away. The industry, she showed, designs every detail to extend time on the machine. Addiction here is engineered into the schedule, not lodged in a broken soul. The same schedule now lives in the device in your pocket. Pull to refresh a feed, and sometimes there is something new. Sometimes there is nothing, and the timing is never predictable. A notification might be a message you want, or nothing at all. Designers speak openly of maximizing the time you spend on the screen. The structure is the slot machine's structure, rebuilt in software. You're not weak when you reach for it again. You're on a schedule. Schedules can also produce behavior that makes no sense at all. In 1948, Skinner ran a famous experiment with hungry pigeons. He set the feeder to drop food at fixed intervals, no matter what. The food came whether the bird did anything useful or not. Yet whatever a bird happened to be doing when food arrived got reinforced. Soon most of the birds were repeating odd little rituals. One turned in circles, another swung its head as if pushing something. Each bird behaved as if its ritual were bringing the food. The parallel in human life is not hard to find. A gambler blows on the dice, a player wears unwashed lucky socks. A reward once followed the act by chance, and the act stuck. No hidden force actually connects the lucky socks to the win. Accidental timing alone is enough to manufacture a private superstition. By now a suspicion may be forming, and it is a fair one. A reinforcer was defined as whatever raises the rate of behavior. And behavior was then explained by pointing to the reinforcer. That looks like a closed circle with no real content inside it. Worse, Skinner refused to say why reinforcement works in the brain. He would not appeal to pleasure, to neurons, to drives, to anything beneath. Is a science that only describes and never explains even a science? To answer that, we must understand why Skinner distrusted explanation itself. Part 5. The Science Without Theory. Start with the charge of circularity, because it has a clean answer. The worry is that reinforcer and behavior define each other in a loop. The escape was spelled out by the psychologist Paul Meehl in 1950. Suppose food strengthens a rat's lever pressing in one setting today. The claim becomes a prediction, not a definition, the moment you move on. That same food should strengthen other behaviors in other animals elsewhere. A reinforcer that works across new situations is a discovery, not a tautology. This property has a name, the transituational character of a reinforcer. Food predicts not just one response, but a wide family of them. That prediction can fail, and sometimes it does, which is the point. A claim that can fail is carrying real information about the world. The circle opens the moment the law reaches beyond the case that defined it. The deeper question remains, why would Skinner refuse to explain at all? In 1950, he asked whether theories of learning were even necessary. By theory, he meant something specific, not just careful thinking. He meant explaining behavior by events on some entirely different level. Events in the nervous system, or the mind, or an abstract model. Such events are measured in different units than the behavior itself. His claim was that you need none of them to predict and control behavior. His alternative was what he called a functional analysis of behavior. Find the lawful relations between what the environment does and what the organism does. Both sides of that relation can be measured directly and publicly. Change the schedule and watch the rate of responding change in step. No guess about hidden machinery is needed to state the relation. The order sits in the link between environment and behavior, fully in the open. Skinner thought inner explanations were not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. Say a man reads because he has a love of reading. The love of reading was invented purely to explain the reading. It adds nothing we did not already see, yet it feels like an answer. And feeling answered, we stop looking for the conditions that built the habit. Skinner called such inventions explanatory fictions, comforting but quite empty. A fiction that ends inquiry is worse than an honest gap in knowledge. This conviction reshaped how Skinner ran experiments, down to the arithmetic. Most of psychology studies large groups and reports their averages. Skinner studied one organism at a time, in fine detail. Watch a single animal long enough to see its behavior stabilize. Then change one variable and watch that same animal shift. Remove the variable and see whether the behavior returns to where it began. If the behavior tracks your changes exactly, you have found a real relation. His objection to averages was not statistical fussiness, but something deeper. An average can describe a group while fitting no real individual in it. A smooth group learning curve can hide sudden jumps in each single learner. The average is a portrait of no one, assembled from everyone. Skinner wanted the law that governs the actual organism in front of him. This argument has found a surprising second life in recent years. Psychology has lived through a crisis over experiments that failed to replicate. Part of the trouble is the very reliance on group averages Skinner attacked. Medicine has revived single-patient trials, testing one person across conditions. The aim is the response of this patient, not the average patient. The methodological instinct Skinner defended was not as eccentric as it looked. But the refusal of theory came at a genuine and lasting cost. Most of science advances by theorizing boldly about things it cannot see. Atoms, genes, and fields were unobservable, and the theories about them paid off. A strict ban on the unseen would have crippled physics and biology. Critics argued Skinner had mistaken a useful caution for an iron law. The dispute over how far his caution should reach is still unsettled. The cost showed most clearly when Skinner turned to language and thought. There, the orderly relations he prized were far harder to pin down. We will reach that battle, and it is the famous one soon. For now, one objection presses harder than any worry about method. Skinner says a full account of behavior needs no inner events. Yet you plainly have thoughts, images, aches and moods inside you. A psychology with no inside seems to leave out the thing you know best. Skinner's answer to this was far stranger than his critics ever admitted. Part 6. The World Beneath the Skin. Most people think behaviorism denies that you have an inner life, that it claims your thoughts and feelings are illusions or do not exist. For Watson's early behaviorism, this charge was close to fair. He had banned the inner world from science as unobservable. If it cannot be seen from outside, it is not the scientist's business. This view has a name, methodological behaviorism, and Skinner rejected it. Skinner's behaviorism was different, and he called it radical behaviorism. Radical here means going to the root, not extreme or reckless. He fully agreed that thoughts, images and feelings are real. A toothache is real, a remembered tune is real, anger is real. His claim was about where they sit, not whether they exist. They occur inside the skin, hidden from everyone but the one person. The skin, he insisted, is not an important boundary for a science. Here is the move that separates Skinner from common sense. He agreed the inner events are real, but denied they are causes. Your anger does not cause you to shout at the driver. The anger and the shouting are two effects of one history. Both flow from your past and your present situation together. Treating the feeling as the cause just hides the real causes from view. The inside is part of the story, but never the first mover. This raises a problem Skinner took more seriously than anyone before him. How does a child ever learn to say the words for private things? Teaching a child the word for apple is easy enough. You both see the apple, you say the word, you correct mistakes. But no one else can see the child's toothache or hunger. A parent cannot point at a pain the way they point at fruit. So how does the word for an ache ever get attached to the ache? Skinner's answer is that the community uses outward signs it can see. The child holds a swollen jaw, or refuses to chew, or cries. A parent sees the candy, the swelling, the hand pressed to the cheek. On that public evidence, the parent supplies the word toothache. The child learns to pair the word with the private feeling underneath. We learn the language of the inside by way of the outside. One consequence of this follows immediately, and it is important. The community can only guess at the private state behind the signs. Two children may be taught the same word for different feelings entirely. Our words for the inner world are trained on shaky public clues. So our reports about ourselves are bound to be rough and unreliable. This is why the inner witness from our first part could not be trusted. The problem was never weak willpower. It was how the words were learned. This picture connects to a result neuroscience has measured directly. Putting a feeling into words does not just describe the feeling. It changes it, which is exactly what an active behavior should do. In studies led by Matthew Lieberman, people labeled emotional faces with words. Naming the emotion calmed activity in the brain's alarm center, the amygdala. Describing a private state reaches in and alters the state described. Now comes the objection that has never been laid to rest. Skinner can explain our talk about pain in fine detail. But there is the pain itself, the raw feel of it. The throb has a quality that no description seems to capture. Philosophers call these felt qualities qualia, the what it is like of experience. The redness of red is not a report, it is something undergone. The philosopher Thomas Nagel sharpened this in 1974 with a question. What is it like from the inside to be a bat? A bat senses the world by bouncing sound off objects in the dark. We could learn every fact about its brain and its behavior. And still we would not know what that life feels like to live. There seems to be a fact about experience no outside account reaches. This gap is now called the hard problem of consciousness. Skinner had a reply, though it satisfies almost no one fully. The feeling, he would say, is simply a state of your own body. What you call the raw feel is your body in a certain condition. Reporting it is behavior learned and controlled like any other. But this still seems to skip past the quality itself. Here, honesty matters more than a tidy ending to the argument. No theory of mind has closed this gap, behaviorist or otherwise. The hard problem confronts neuroscience and brain scans just as squarely. Still, Skinner had to face the most demanding private behavior of all. Not feeling, but the silent activity we use to think. When you reason, you are mostly talking to yourself without sound. Thinking for Skinner was largely verbal behavior turned inward and quiet. If that is right, then language is the key to the whole mind. And language is the hardest thing his theory ever tried to claim. It is also where his greatest rival was waiting to destroy him. Part 7. Language as Behavior. We left Skinner facing the hardest behavior of all, human language. If thinking is mostly silent speech, then language holds the whole mind. The common view of language feels too obvious to question. A word stands for a thing and carries a meaning inside it. You have a thought, you find the word, and you say it. Speech, on this view, is the outward sign of an inner meaning. Skinner refused to ask what a word means at all. He asked a different question. What makes the speaker say it? What conditions, present and past, actually produce this particular utterance? The unit of analysis is not the word paired with a meaning. It is the relation between the speaker's conditions and the speech. change the conditions, and the same sounds become a different behavior. Take the simplest verbal act, which Skinner called the mand. A mand is speech driven by a need or a discomfort. A thirsty person says water, and the word specifies its own reward. The reinforcer is the water itself, handed over by a listener. A command, a request, a demand, a plea, all share this structure. The form of the word tells you what the speaker is missing. Now take a different act, which Skinner called the tact. A tact is speech controlled by something in the world. You see a hawk overhead and you say the word hawk. Nothing material is handed to you for saying it correctly. The reward is social, a nod, a yes, mere agreement. The tact is naming, reporting, describing the world to a listener. Here the whole picture turns and meaning starts to dissolve. The very same word can be a mand or a tact. A toddler says water while reaching toward a cup, thirsty. That is a mand, driven by deprivation, reinforced by a drink. The same toddler says water while pointing at a pond, calm. That is a tact, driven by the sight, reinforced by approval. Same sound, two behaviours, two histories, two sets of causes. The word is not one thing. The controlling relation is the thing. This is not just a clever distinction with no real consequences. In teaching language to children with autism, the split appears plainly. A child may learn to label water on sight, a tact. Yet that same child may be unable to request water when thirsty. The two skills must often be taught separately, one at a time. If a word were a single unit of meaning, this could not happen. Most of conversation belongs to a third type, the intraverbal. An intraverbal is speech controlled by other speech, not by things. Someone says, "How are you?" and you answer fine, automatically. Someone says, "Capital of France," and out comes the answer, Paris. The word fine is not a report on your inner state. It is a verbal response, wired to a verbal prompt. Conversation runs largely on these learned chains of word following word. Skinner used a single example that exposes a deep confusion. We say the name Caesar refers to the man Caesar. But that man has been dead for 2,000 years. Your saying Caesar is not a response to any present Caesar. It is a response to other words, a verbal chain. We mistake relations between words for relations between words and things. Skinner added one more layer, which he called the autoclitic. The autoclitic is speech about your own speech, shaping its effect. Saying, "I think it will rain," is not the same as "it will rain." The words, "I think," tell the listener how firmly to take it. Grammar, word order, and qualifiers all do this quiet work. They are behaviour that arranges other behaviour for the listener. With these few units, Skinner tried to rebuild all of language. Meaning, reference and grammar became relations you could, in principle, observe. It was the boldest extension of his system he ever attempted, but the whole book had a weakness its admirers rarely admit. It contained almost no experiments on real human speech at all. It was interpretation, a way of seeing, not a body of proof. And in 1959, a young linguist set out to demolish it. Many believe that he succeeded and ended behaviorism in one stroke. Part 8. Did Chomsky win? The linguist was Noam Chomsky, and his review appeared in 1959. It is the most famous book review in the history of social science. Within a decade, behaviorism had lost its grip on psychology. Many date the cognitive revolution to that single piece of writing. To judge it fairly, we must first state his case at full force. Chomsky began from a plain fact about how people speak. You constantly produce sentences that you have never once heard before. This very sentence is almost certainly new to the world, yet you understand it and could answer it without effort. No one ever reinforced you for these exact novel sentences, so a history of rewarded responses cannot be where they came from. Then Chomsky pressed the point that became his lasting signature. Listen to the speech a child actually hears each day. It is limited, full of slips, half-finished, and often ungrammatical. From this messy input, every normal child builds a full grammar. The grammar they reach goes far beyond anything the input contained. This famous argument is called the poverty of the stimulus. The evidence is too thin to support what the child learns. From those premises, Chomsky's conclusion follows with considerable force. If the input cannot supply the grammar, something inside must. Children must be born already prepared, in advance, to acquire language. Chomsky called this a language acquisition device, a built-in faculty. Beneath the world's languages lies a shared, innate, universal grammar. Language is not learned from scratch. It is grown from a seed. Chomsky also turned Skinner's own vocabulary against him quite sharply. Terms like stimulus and reinforcement had precise meanings in the lab. Used strictly, they plainly do not fit a person talking freely. What stimulus controls a poet? What reward shapes an idle remark? Stretched to cover speech, the terms lost all their content. Either the words were false, Chomsky argued, or they were empty. This was devastating, and for a generation it looked decisive. But there is a long-running objection to the review itself. The charge is that Chomsky attacked a book Skinner did not write. A reply by Kenneth McCorquodale in 1970 laid this out. It argued that the review missed almost everything central to Skinner. The first complaint is about reflexes, and it matters a great deal. Chomsky often wrote as if Skinner saw speech as reflexes, as if each word were yanked out by a present stimulus. But that is the respondent behaviour Skinner spent his life rejecting. Operant speech is emitted, then selected by its effects over time. Attacking the reflex view left Skinner's actual view untouched. The second complaint concerns what Skinner ever claimed to explain. Chomsky read him as saying reward was the only cause of speech, and that the controlling conditions were always entirely sufficient by themselves. Skinner had claimed no such thing, and had said so repeatedly. He fully accepted that genes and biology shape what an organism can do. The straw figure was easy to burn. The real position was harder. Fairness requires handing Chomsky's strongest point straight back to him. The poverty of the stimulus is a serious argument, not a trick. And Skinner's own units were never tested, as his other work was. McCorquodale himself admitted there were no decisive facts to cite. Skinner described how speech might work, in elaborate and careful detail. He never showed that real sentences are truly produced that way. The argument did not end in 1970, and it is alive right now. Start with what infants turn out to extract from raw speech. In 1996, researchers played 8-month-olds a stream of nonsense syllables. There were no pauses, no cues, only the flow of sound. After 2 minutes, the infants had found the hidden word boundaries. They had tracked which syllables tend to follow which others. Babies mine the statistics of speech far more than Chomsky assumed. Then came a kind of machine that sharpened the question enormously. A large language model is trained to predict the next word. It is given no grammar, no rules, no innate language faculty. It sees only oceans of text and learns simply to continue it. And it produces fluent grammatical language across almost any topic. Some argue this finally refutes the poverty of the stimulus. A general learner with no built-in grammar seems to learn grammar. The defenders of innate grammar have a powerful reply ready. A child hears perhaps tens of millions of words by age 5. These models are trained on trillions, a vastly richer diet. So they show structure can be learned, but not from a child's input. They also never touch the world their words are about. Chomsky himself has dismissed them as telling us nothing about minds. He argues they would learn impossible languages just as easily. Recent tests suggest they in fact find human-like languages easier, which cuts against him. So the fair answer to our question is carefully mixed. Chomsky clearly won the historical war over the direction of psychology. Behaviorism lost the field, and the mind came roaring back. But the deepest empirical question has reopened in our own time. Can structure arise from experience without a grammar built in? The evidence now leans further toward learning than Chomsky allowed. It does not settle the matter, and pretending otherwise would misrepresent where the field now stands. We can step back from the question of who defeated whom. Skinner had noticed something about language no one else stressed. Words can do what no direct experience can ever do. They let you act on consequences you have never met yourself. A sign reading thin ice keeps you off a lake you never tested. Behavior can be controlled by a description, not only by a burn. That power and its hidden cost is what Skinner examined next. Part 9. The Rules We Live By. Skinner drew a distinction here he ranked among his most important. There are 2 very different ways your behavior can be controlled. The first is the one we have studied all along. Direct consequences slowly shape what you do through trial and effect. Skinner called this contingency-shaped behavior, built only by direct experience. It is how the pigeon learned, and how the burned hand learns. The second way belongs only to creatures that have language. Your behavior can be controlled by a statement about consequences. Someone tells you the rule, and you act on the words. Skinner called a rule a contingency specifying stimulus, a verbal description. It states what leads to what, without your living through it. Behavior under the control of such words is called rule-governed behavior. The difference between the two is easiest to see with a stove. One child learns that the stove burns by touching it once. The lesson is direct and painful, and it needs no words at all. Another child hears, "Do not touch the stove, it is hot." That child stays away and is never burned at all. Both children end up with the very same correct, careful behavior. But one learned from a burn, the other from a sentence. This second route is one of the great achievements of our species. You can act wisely in situations you have never once faced. You avoid poisons, cliffs and frauds you have never encountered. You can work for a reward that arrives years from now. And you inherit the hard-won lessons of everyone before you. A whole civilization's caution can pass to a child in a phrase. Rules let us skip the slow, dangerous school of direct experience. But this gift carries a cost that runs deep in human trouble. A rule can keep controlling you after the world has changed. The behavior that the words command may no longer work. Yet you keep doing it, because the rule still says so. Researchers call this the insensitivity effect, and it is well shown. People who learn a task by instruction adapt more slowly to change. Those who learned by direct trial notice the shift far sooner. We keep doing what should work, long after it stops working. Later, behavior analysts sorted rule-following into kinds, and the kinds matter. The first is following a rule to win social approval. You obey because a person may praise or punish your obedience. This kind is called pliance, and it can turn rigid. Drivers in one study buckled their seatbelts when watched. Add a visible observer, and compliance with the sign jumped. The behavior tracked the audience, not the danger of the road. The second kind follows a rule that truly maps the world. You obey because the rule correctly describes what really works. This kind is called tracking, and it stays sensitive to results. It bends when the world shows the rule has gone wrong. A third kind changes how much a consequence even matters to you, telling a child to eat greens to grow big and strong. The distant payoff is made vivid enough in words to pull behavior now. This framework reaches far beyond seatbelts and eating vegetables. A great deal of human suffering is rule-following gone wrong. We cling to old rules about ourselves that no longer fit. I must never fail, I must be liked, I cannot cope. These verbal rules keep steering us past all contrary evidence. A powerful modern therapy was built on exactly this insight, as we will see. There is one use of rules more intimate than all the others. You can give rules to yourself in your own silent speech. You talk yourself out of the second drink, or into the gym. This is the everyday battle we call willpower or self-control. And Skinner's account of that battle overturns the usual picture. There is, he argued, no inner strong man holding the line. Part 10. The Self that Controls Itself. Everyone knows the feeling of fighting a temptation from within. A second slice of cake sits there, and part of you wants it. Another part pushes back and tries to hold the line. We call the winner willpower and the loser weakness of will. The strong-willed resist, we say, and the weak give in. An inner self, either strong or weak, is thought to decide the contest. This picture has two problems, and the first is familiar. Calling success willpower only renames the success we already saw. It is the explanatory fiction we met earlier, comforting and hollow. The second problem is harder, and it comes from the facts. The very same person is strong at dawn and weak at midnight. In the morning you resolve to skip the cake entirely. By evening the resolve is gone, and the cake is eaten. A fixed inner strength cannot explain a preference that flips on schedule. If your will were simply strong, it would be strong at night. Something other than a steady inner force must be at work. Skinner's move, as ever, was to look outside the person. Self-control, he argued, is not a single act, but two of them. There is a controlling response, and there is a controlled response. The controlled response is the thing you want to prevent. Eating the cake, lighting the cigarette, checking the phone again. The controlling response is something else you do to the world. You change your surroundings so the controlled response grows unlikely. You do not defeat the urge, you re-engineer its circumstances. The methods are humble, and you already use most of them. You lock the sweets away or never buy them at all. You leave the credit card at home before walking past the shops. You refuse to go grocery shopping while you are still hungry. You put the phone in another room to do focused work. Each move changes the environment, not some hidden inner strength. The willpower is in the arranging, done before the moment of temptation. A natural question arises here, and Skinner met it head-on. If you arrange your world, who is the you that arranges? It is tempting to slip the inner commander back in here, but that controlling response is itself shaped by its own consequences. You learn to lock the cabinet because past binges were punished. The hangover, the regret, the bill, all selected the controlling habit. There is no commander. There is behavior controlling behavior, all from outside. Decades later, behavioral economists gave this account a precise shape. They measured how we value rewards that arrive after a delay. A reward far in the future is worth much less to us now, but the discount is not gentle and steady over time. It is steep and bowed, dropping fast as delay grows. This shape is called hyperbolic discounting, found in people and animals. Near rewards loom huge, while distant ones shrink almost to nothing. This bowed curve leads to a strange and very powerful result. Two such curves for two rewards will cross each other. Seen from far away, you prefer the larger, later reward. Health next year easily beats the cake tonight in advance. But as the cake comes near, its curve shoots upward, and your preference flips, so the nearer cake suddenly wins. In one study, 34 of 36 people reversed this way. Temptation is not a failure of strength. It is the geometry of delay. Once you can see the reversal coming, a strategy appears. Your present self can bind your future self in advance. Ulysses ordered his sailors to tie him to the ship's mast. He knew the song of the sirens would overpower him later. So he removed his own future choice while he still could. People now post money they lose if they break a goal. This is precisely Skinner's controlling response, rediscovered and made exact. A picture of the self emerges that is hard to forget. You are not a single ruler issuing commands from within. You are more like a crowd of competing interests over time. Your evening self and your morning self want different things. Each must outmaneuver the other by arranging the shared world. The unified inner agent dissolves into a system of behavior managing behavior. We have now watched behavior shaped and steered from every side. Direct consequences shape it, words guide it, and it manages itself. But one enormous question has been sitting underneath all of it. Why is an organism the kind of thing consequences can shape? Where did this strange sensitivity to outcomes ever come from? Skinner's deepest answer reached all the way back to the origin of life. Part 11. Selection by consequences. To answer that question, Skinner reached for a new idea of cause. We usually picture causation as one thing physically pushing another. A cue ball strikes the 8-ball and drives it forward. The cause comes first and shoves the effect into motion. This is the only kind of cause physics seemed to allow. But living things present a second appearance, one of purpose. Animals and their organs look as though they are aimed at goals. The eye looks built for seeing, the wing built for flight. They seem pulled toward a purpose lying in the future. For most of history, this look of design demanded a designer. Something with foresight, it was assumed, must have aimed them. Darwin shattered that assumption with one strange and powerful idea. You can get design with no designer and no foresight. Organisms vary, and some of those variations survive and reproduce better. Nothing aimed the eye at seeing in advance on purpose. Eyes that happen to see better left behind more offspring. The future does not pull. The past consequences filter and select. Apparent purpose is the track left by selection working backward. Skinner's great insight was that this is not unique to evolution. The very same kind of logic runs inside a single lifetime. Behavior varies, and its consequences select which variants come back. This is what we saw with shaping, sculpting form from variation. And it explains the reversal of cause from much earlier. A consequence after the act is not a future cause. It is selection, the same patient filter that built the eye. Skinner then placed this idea inside a much larger frame. Selection by consequences operates at 3 different levels at once. The first is the species, shaped across vast evolutionary time. Survival selects the bodies and instincts a creature is born with. The second is the individual, shaped across a single life. Reinforcement selects the behaviors that a creature acquires while alive. The third is the culture, shaped as practices pass between people. What works for a group is copied, taught, and carried onward. Now, the question we ended on finally has its answer. Why can consequences shape an animal's behavior at all? Because the first level built the second level into the creature. An animal that could learn within its life out-survived a rigid one. Where fixed instinct ran out, the capacity to be conditioned took over. The sensitivity to consequences was itself selected, because it paid. The philosopher Daniel Dennett gave this idea a memorable shape. He pictured a tower of creatures, each smarter than the last. On the ground floor stand creatures wired entirely by evolution. Their behavior is fixed in advance, with no learning at all. One floor up live what Dennett explicitly named Skinnerian creatures. They try out actions and keep the ones that get reinforced. Higher still are creatures that test actions in imagination first. They let their bad guesses die in their place instead of dying themselves. But the middle level has limits the early behaviorists underestimated. They had hoped reinforcement was universal, working on anything equally. Any response, any cue, any animal, all of it equally trainable. Two findings broke that hope, and they came from the lab. The most damaging was reported by Skinner's own former students. Keller and Marion Brayland trained animals for shows and films. They found that their animals kept sliding back into raw instinct. A raccoon taught to drop coins began rubbing them instead. A pig trained the same way rooted the coins in the dirt. The instinctive behavior steadily overpowered the behavior they had conditioned. They titled their report A Pointed Jab, the misbehavior of organisms. The second finding came from a study with rats and sickness. John Garcia gave rats water that was sweet, bright, and noisy. Then he paired that water with either a shock or nausea. The nauseous rats avoided the taste, but ignored the light and sound. The shocked rats avoided the light and sound, but not the taste. Taste links to sickness. Sights and sounds link to pain. The animal arrives prepared, biased about what connects to what. These limits are often read as defeats for Skinner, wrongly. They show the second level, operating inside the limits of the first. Evolution decides in advance what an animal is ready to learn. Reinforcement then works within those inherited boundaries, not past them. The levels are real and ordered, exactly as the theory requires. The third level, culture, is where the theory grows thin. When Skinner published this idea, critics pressed a hard question. Richard Dawkins, among them, asked what exactly gets selected here. In evolution, the gene is the clear unit being copied. In a culture, what is the unit, and what does the selecting? Skinner never offered a sharp and fully satisfying answer to this. Whole fields still work on what a unit of culture even is. Where does the idea stand today, level by level? At the level of species, selection is no longer doubted. We found its mechanism, the gene, and the case closed. At the level of behavior, the mechanism is only now emerging. It lives in the chemistry of the brain, which comes later. But one consequence of the cultural level cannot wait. If practices are selected by their effects, a culture can be designed. And that means someone is already arranging the world that shapes you. Part 12. The Hidden Architecture of Control. We ended on a disturbing thought that your world is being arranged. By whom and through what means is the question now. We normally describe our institutions by the values they claim. Government serves justice, religion serves the soul, schools serve knowledge. And we picture ourselves as free agents who opt in. Skinner looked at the same institutions and saw machinery for control. Each institution, in his analysis, arranges rewards and punishments at scale. Each shapes the behavior of millions of people through its contingencies. And each tends to arrange them so that it survives. Skinner called these the great controlling agencies of a society. Strip away the noble language, and the contingencies stand exposed. Consider government, which Skinner defined with deliberate brutal economy. A government, he wrote, runs mainly on the power to punish. The law sorts behavior into the allowed and the forbidden. Forbidden acts are then tied to fines, to prison, to force. You obey the speed limit because of consequences arranged in advance. Religion, in the same analysis, works through promised and threatened consequences. Reward and punishment are placed in a life beyond this one. Virtue and sin become labels carrying vast and lasting stakes. Economic life runs on a planar reinforcer, which is money. Wages arrange your days around the schedule of your pay. Skinner even likened wage labour to a refined form of control. Education controls through grades, marks, and the approval of teachers. It builds the skills a society wants by reinforcing them. Psychotherapy he treated with particular suspicion for a specific reason. It chases inner causes he thought were fictions, an impossible task. Yet he saw what it did that worked in his terms. It offered a rare audience that did not punish what you said. Beneath all these sits the oldest controlling agency of all. It is the group itself, with its approval and disapproval. A glance, a frown, a word of praise, these shape us constantly. Even tyrants, Skinner noted, ultimately depend upon the group around them. And the group's power has a dark side he did not hide. The same approval that builds kindness can build a lynch mob. But control in Skinner's world never runs in one direction only. The controlled person also acts back upon whoever is controlling. He gave this a name, counter-control, and it appears everywhere. You escape a tyrant, resist a boss, or simply withdraw. Behavior is shaped by the environment and reshapes it in return. The relation is reciprocal, a constant push between two parties. From this angle, Skinner read our ideals in a startling way. The great writings on liberty are, he claimed, tools of counter-control. They are weapons developed against control through fear and pain. They taught people to escape and resist their aversive controllers. Freedom, on this view, names a set of techniques, not a soul. Parts of this analysis have aged badly, and we should say so. Some of Skinner's examples cast women in narrow and dated roles. But the structural claim does not depend on those examples. The claim is that control is not the exception in life. It is the water you have always been swimming in. Acting freely and being controlled, he argued, are fully compatible. If control is everywhere, the usual question is the wrong one. Asking whether you are controlled at all misses the point entirely. The real questions are who controls and how and for whom, by fear or by reward, for your good or for theirs. And here a cherished belief begins to look like a problem. If you are always controlled, in what sense are you free? Skinner was about to attack freedom itself, and the world recoiled. Part 13. The Author Who Was Never There. You experience yourself as the true author of your own actions. A choice feels like it begins in you and flows outward. You take credit when you do well and blame when you fail. On this rests responsibility, law, morality, and human dignity itself. The free inner agent feels less like a theory than a fact. Skinner spent his last decades arguing that this agent does not exist. His argument runs straight out of everything we have built so far. Recall the explanatory fiction, the inner cause invented to explain behavior. The autonomous self, he argued, is the grandest fiction of all. We invoke it whenever we cannot yet name the real causes. A man steals, and we say he chose to, freely. But that explains nothing we did not already see him do. And here the autonomous self begins to shrink before our eyes. Each time we find a real cause, we credit it instead. The poverty, the hunger, the history of that man's reinforcement, whatever the environment explains, the inner chooser no longer needs to. As the science advances, the free inner agent keeps retreating. Skinner concluded that a finished science would abolish it entirely. Then comes the move that made the whole world furious. Our ideals of freedom and dignity, he claimed, now hold us back. Once they were weapons against control through fear and force. We met them earlier as techniques of counter-control against tyrants. But now they make us refuse to design better environments. We will not engineer the conditions that would produce good behavior. We cling to the free agent, and so we keep failing. Skinner's deepest target in this whole project was punishment itself. Most of our control of each other runs on aversive methods. We threaten, fine, shame, imprison, and inflict pain to change behavior. And Skinner argued with real evidence that punishment works badly. It suppresses behavior briefly without building anything in its place. It breeds escape, aggression, anxiety, and a steady, quiet resistance. Prisons, he noted, mostly produce better criminals, not better people. Positive reinforcement, he insisted, is both kinder and far more effective. So the choice is never between control and freedom from control. It is between control by fear and control by reward. Between the punishments we barely notice and the rewards we could design. Defending the free agent, Skinner said, defends the cruelty we already use. This was the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and it sold enormously. It also drew the most savage critique of Skinner's career. Noam Chomsky returned in 1971 to attack the whole project. His essay was titled, quite plainly, The Case Against Skinner, and his central charge was the same one he made in 1959. The science is either false or it is empty of content. Chomsky pressed a simple example that does a great deal of damage. Skinner calls persuasion merely a weak and ineffective method of control. But persuasion cannot be described as arranging rewards at all. A good argument can change your mind with no reinforcement in sight. If so, behaviour is not fixed by the contingencies Skinner studies. And then the book's central thesis, Chomsky argued, is simply false. Chomsky then drove the very point to its breaking edge. Skinner had written that we change verbal behaviour, not opinions. Take that claim literally and follow it where it leads. Force a man under torture to say, "The earth stands still." By Skinner's words, you have now changed the man's opinion. Chomsky's reply to this was 3 words. Comment is unnecessary. His sharpest blow landed on the central conclusion of the book. Skinner moved from the fact that our freedom is limited to the grand claim that the free inner agent is an illusion. Chomsky said that Leap fails to grasp the rudiments of science. That behaviour is influenced does not show it is wholly determined, and being influenced certainly does not prove the science is true. Beneath the logic ran a political fear Chomsky would not drop. Suppose we did hand society to the designers of contingencies. Who designs the designers, and toward whose vision of the good? The science can build behaviour, but cannot say which behaviour is right. A benevolent planner and a tyrant use the very same tools. Skinner offered no protection against the second kind of planner. Skinner had answers, and they are stronger than his critics allowed. The free agent, he said, never explained anything in the first place. Feeling free, he argued, is compatible with being thoroughly controlled, and the planner is not a god standing outside the system. The designer is shaped by consequences exactly like everyone else. This is not a contradiction, he said, only a relocation of cause. Yet 2 problems sit at the centre, and neither is solved. The first is the question of values, and it is fatal to the grand plan. Science can tell you how to produce a given behaviour. It cannot tell you whether that behaviour is good or for whom. Skinner fell back on the survival of the culture as his goal. But why survival should be the goal is itself a value. And no experiment on pigeons can ever supply that value. The second problem is the very one Chomsky kept circling back to. If there is no autonomous self, who exactly chooses to design? Skinner relocates the chooser into the environment, but never dissolves it. Whether that move fully escapes the puzzle remains an open question. His deflation of the inner author did anticipate much later science. We now know the self confabulates, as our very first part showed. But the leap from influence behaviour to no free agent overreaches. On freedom, Skinner saw something real, and then claimed far too much. Skinner did not merely argue in the abstract for designing environments. Years before this book, he had already drawn the blueprint. He had written a novel describing the whole engineered society, a community run entirely on reward, with all punishment abolished. People found it either a paradise or a quiet nightmare. To judge it, we have to walk inside the world he built. Part 14. The Engineered Society. In 1948, Skinner published a novel he came to prize above all. It was called Walden 2, after Thoreau's Pond and Retreat. It describes a small community of about 1,000 people. The community is built from the ground up on a science of behavior. Its founder, a man named Fraser, guides a visiting group through it, and the first surprising thing is what the place refuses to be. It is not a fixed utopia with a finished set of rules. Fraser insists that nothing in the community is ever permanent. Every practice is a hypothesis, kept only while it works. The motto of the place is to accept no eternal truth. You experiment, you measure, and you change whatever the evidence condemns. The culture treats itself as a laboratory that never closes. Consider how the community handles all of its least pleasant work. Nobody is ordered to clean the sewers or to haul garbage. Instead, the unpleasant jobs are simply worth more labour credits. A nasty hour earns far more than a pleasant one. So the worst jobs fill quickly, in very few hours. Most members finish their daily work in about 4 hours. No one is forced, yet everything that must be done gets done. The most striking part of the design is aimed at the children. They are raised in common and trained in self-control from the start. In one scene, young children wear lollipops on strings around their necks. They are taught not to lick them for a set time. Later, they stand hungry before warm soup and wait calmly. This is the controlling response from earlier, built deliberately into a child. The community manufactures the very willpower we struggle to find. Much of the design is a list of things removed. There is no money and little private property in the usual sense. There are no heroes, no champions, no cult of the great man. Competition is engineered out because it makes most people losers. What remains is art, music, conversation, and a great deal of rest. By every visible measure, the people of Walden too are happy. And here the novel turns on its own deepest problem. A visiting philosopher named Castle attacks the entire arrangement directly. These people are happy, he says, but they are not free. Every taste and value they hold was engineered into them. Fraser does not flinch, and his reply is quietly chilling. He admits he feels like a god who has planned it all. He has made people who do as he designed while feeling free. This is the problem that has haunted the book ever since. Is a contented life still free if it was wholly arranged? Castle calls it a benevolent tyranny, a cage no one feels. Fraser replies that all of us are arranged by something. At least here, he says, the arranging is gentle and chosen well. Skinner gives Fraser the better lines, but the unease never lifts. The lollipop scene quietly carries the entire dilemma inside it. Earlier, you arranged your own world to master a temptation. That controlling response was yours, chosen and owned by you. Here, the controlling response is installed by designers in a child. The behavior looks the same from the outside, calm and controlled. But whose willpower is it when someone else built it in? The novel did not stay safely on the page for very long. Sales jumped from a few hundred a year to 100,000. In the 1960s, readers tried to build it for real. Roughly 36 communities formed themselves around the book's ideas. Most collapsed within a few years, and the reasons rhyme. Factions, work disputes, and bitter struggles over who would lead. 2 of those communities are, remarkably, still standing today. Twin Oaks in Virginia began on the Walden II plan. It kept the labor credit system but dropped the explicit behaviorism. Los Horcones in Mexico held tightly to the science of behavior. Skinner himself praised it as the closest thing to his vision. But one finding from the failed communities cuts deepest of all. In nearly everyone, almost everyone, wanted to be Frasier. Everyone wished to be the gentle designer who arranges the contingencies. Almost no one wished to be the person being designed. The dream of benevolent control attracts people who want control. That is the unsolved knot at the heart of the whole vision. Still, Skinner's technology of behavior was no longer just fiction. It was about to be tried on real people, in the open. The first place it landed was the most ordinary one imaginable, the classroom. Part 15. The Technology of Teaching. Skinner's interest in teaching began with one ordinary school visit. He sat in on a mathematics lesson in his daughter's class. And he saw a machine for producing failure running at full speed. Every child was pushed through the same material at one pace. The quick ones were bored, the slow ones were already lost, and the answers came back days later, far too late to matter. The deep problem, in his terms, was about reinforcement and timing. Learning is shaped best by immediate consequences for small, correct steps. A private tutor can do this, response by response, all day, but no teacher can tutor 30 children all at once. So the reinforcement that builds skill arrives rarely and late. Skinner set out to give every student a tireless private tutor. His solution was a device he called a teaching machine. It presented a small piece of material, then asked for a response. The student answered, and learned at once whether it was right. Then the next small piece, and the next at the student's own pace. The content was broken into tiny steps, in a careful sequence. This patient, step-by-step method became known as programmed instruction. It was simply shaping, the building of competence by small approximations. The guiding rule was to make each step almost trivially small. Each step should be one the student can nearly always take. Yet each one moves a little closer to full competence. Make the steps small enough, and reinforcement arrives almost constantly. And the sting of being wrong is reduced almost to nothing. The teacher's job changes from presenting to programming the contingencies. Behind all this lay a blunt charge against ordinary schooling. Our schools, Skinner argued, are still built on aversive control. Children work mainly to avoid bad grades, shame and punishment, and we have already seen what aversive control reliably produces. Escape and avoidance, here taking the form of dread and daydreaming. The student learns to hate the subject and flee the room. Build skill on reward instead, and the dread has no reason to form. This was not only theory, and one application clearly worked. Skinner's colleague Fred Keller built a college course on these ideas. Students moved at their own pace through a sequence of units. No one advanced to the next until each unit was fully mastered. Mastery, not the calendar, decided when a student moved on. Where it was tried carefully, students learned more and forgot less. And yet the teaching machine was mocked and slowly abandoned. The 1970s turned toward the mind and away from behavior. Critics pictured children sitting alone at machines, an inhuman classroom. A machine, they said, cannot teach a love of the subject. Nor can it teach the messy art of real thinking. Skinner fought this decline bitterly, almost to his final year. But the principles did not die. They simply changed clothes. Look closely at the learning apps on your own phone. Lessons arrive in tiny steps with instant right or wrong feedback. You move at your own pace and progress is constant. Mastery systems hold you on a topic until you have it. The teaching machine Skinner was ridiculed for now lives in millions of pockets. And, broadly, it works in the way he said it would. But the same technology has a second face, and it is darker. A language app teaches you with small steps and quick rewards. It also keeps you hooked with streaks and unpredictable notifications. That is the variable schedule from before, the slot machine logic. The very same tools can serve your goals or the company's. The science tells you only how to change behavior efficiently. It says nothing at all about what that behavior should be. In a classroom, with a willing student chasing a goal, this is a gift. The learner sets the target and the technology helps them reach it. But change the subject from a willing student to a helpless one. Aim the technology at a child who cannot consent at all. Aim it not at a skill they want, but at who they are. There, the technology of behavior became the most bitter fight of all. Part 16. The Ethics of Changing a Person. Skinner's tools, applied directly to people, became applied behavior analysis. Its largest use by far is in the treatment of autism. And no part of his legacy is fought over more bitterly. The work began with Ivar Lovaas in the 1960s. He ran intensive programs, often 40 hours a week, with autistic children. His famous study claimed that nearly half reached ordinary functioning. We have to begin with what this approach truly accomplishes. For many children, the gains are real and deeply valued. A non-verbal child can be taught to ask for what they need. That is the mand from earlier, built patiently, step by step. And some children injure themselves severely, banging their heads for hours. Behavioral work can stop a child from going blind or deaf. For those families, it is not abstract, it is protection. But the history carries a much darker thread inside it. Lovaas's early programs also relied on slaps, shouts, and shocks. And one institution still uses painful electric shocks even today. It was founded in 1971 by a man named Matthew Israel. Israel came directly out of the Walden II community movement. The positive reinforcement utopia had produced, by one path, its opposite. The place is now called the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center. Some residents wear backpacks wired to electrodes on their skin. Staff can deliver a painful 2-second shock by remote control. The shock is meant to suppress dangerous or unwanted behavior. In one case, a boy was restrained and shocked 31 times. A United Nations investigator called the practice a form of torture. The fight to ban the device has dragged on for years. The Food and Drug Administration first banned it back in 2020. A court overturned the ban the following year on narrow grounds. Congress then granted the agency clearer authority to ban it. The agency proposed a fresh ban in 2024, then stalled. As of the middle of 2026, no final ban has come. Decades after Skinner, the aversive control he hated still operates. Even the gentler modern forms of the therapy face fierce attack. The critique comes most powerfully from autistic adults speaking for themselves. Much of the therapy, they argue, aims at making children look normal. It suppresses the gentle, self-soothing movements many autistic people use. It rewards eye contact and stillness and trains the child to mask, and masking in adulthood is linked to anxiety, exhaustion, and trauma. The goal, critics say, is conformity dressed up as treatment. At the centre of this sits a question we have met before. Behavioural methods can reliably produce whatever behaviour is chosen as the target. But who gets to choose the target and by whose values? The child's, the parents', or a society that wants typical children? A young child cannot consent to being remade from the inside. This is the freedom and dignity problem, no longer on the page. The field has a serious reply, and it deserves a hearing. Defenders say the worst practices belong to an older era. Modern programs increasingly ask the child's assent and follow their lead. They drop all aversives and target skills the child actually wants. The field is in real upheaval, arguing fiercely with itself. More autistic voices now sit inside that argument than ever before. Critics answer that compliance is still the quiet underlying goal, and they note a newer pressure distorting the whole field. Investors have bought up many providers chasing a growing market. That can push for more hours and more billing, not better care. The debate is far from resolved, and the stakes are children. If we step back, the deepest lesson finally comes into focus. The technology of behaviour is, in itself, neither good nor evil. The same tools give a child words and stop her self-injury. The same tools enforce conformity and, at the extreme, deliver shocks. The science can tell you exactly how to change a person. It cannot tell you which changes are worth making or for whom. Skinner saw that control is inescapable. He underrated the question of its purpose. Applied behaviour analysis carried Skinner's tools deep into human action. But the part of the mind he struggled with most was language. And language was where Chomsky had seemed to bury him for good. Yet the behavioural tradition was not finished with the mind. It produced a new account of thought and a new therapy with it, and that account finally answered the very challenge Chomsky had raised. Part 17. The Mind That Came Back. The textbook story of all this is short and confident. The cognitive revolution arrived, and behaviorism quietly died off. Chomsky's review was the killing blow, and psychology turned inward. The mind came back, now pictured as a kind of computer. Thoughts became programs, memory became storage, perception became information processing, and Skinner was filed away as a strange historical mistake. This story is tidy and popular, and it is not quite true. Behaviorism did not really die so much as quietly divide. One branch became the applied clinical work we just examined. Another branch went straight back to the problem of language. It set out to answer the exact challenge Chomsky had posed, and decades later it produced a serious and surprising answer. Recall the core of Chomsky's case, the problem of endless novelty. We produce endless sentences never heard and never directly reinforced. The new theory locates this power in a single learned skill. Humans learn to relate things to one another in flexible ways. Same as, opposite of, bigger than, earlier than, part of. And we apply these relations by context, not by physical likeness. The crucial feature is that these relations come in pairs and chains. Suppose you tell a child only that A is larger than B. Without any further teaching, the child knows B is smaller than A. Now add that B is larger than C, and chains form. The child derives that A beats C untaught on the spot. A few trained relations explode into a web of derived ones. These relations do something stranger than just connect words. They transform how the related things actually move and affect us. Show a child a strange new coin they have never seen. Tell them it is worth more than their favourite old coin. At once the new coin becomes the one they want most. No reward was ever paired with that new coin at all. The relation alone reached in and changed its pull on the child. Now the old challenge of novelty meets a fully learning-based answer. Endless new combinations need no grammar built into the brain. They flow from one general skill, the skill of relating. Once a child masters that skill, the combinations become limitless. Generativity is real, but it is itself learned, not inherited. The tradition Chomsky buried had quietly answered his deepest objection. Honesty demands that we mark the limits of this answer. Mainstream linguistics has largely ignored this relational account entirely. Whether it can capture the full machinery of grammar is disputed. It is a serious research program, not a finished victory. But it does what the 1957 book never managed to do. This relational account also grew into a widely used therapy. It rests on a striking idea about the roots of human suffering. The same language that frees us can also trap us. We fuse with our own verbal rules and treat them as facts. I am worthless, I cannot cope, this feeling must be removed. These are the rigid rules from earlier, ruling us past all evidence. And we exhaust ourselves trying to escape our own inner experience. The therapy's move is unlike the usual approach to thoughts. It does not argue you out of a painful belief. It loosens the grip the words have on your behavior. You learn to see a thought as a thought, not a command. The sentence, "I am a failure," becomes just a sentence passing through. Strip a verbal rule of its literal power, and it stops ruling you. This therapy has spread quickly and gathered a real evidence base. It helps with anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and much more. But honesty requires two careful qualifications about that record. It rarely outperforms standard cognitive therapy in head-to-head trials. And whether its deep theory drives its results is still debated. It works, but exactly why it works remains an open question. There is a final irony in this whole story worth facing. The cognitive science that defeated Skinner explained behavior a certain way. It filled the mind with inner representations, programs, and computations. These are precisely the inner causes Skinner called explanatory fictions. Are they real machinery or just elaborate new names for behavior? That very question still divides the philosophy of mind today. So the title of this part has two meanings at once. The mind came back into psychology, as the textbooks say. But the behavioral tradition also came back to the mind, and in truth, neither camp ever fully defeated the other. One enormous question, though, was left untouched by both. Why does reinforcement change a brain in the first place? That answer came not from the warring schools of psychology. It came from neuroscience and from the engineers building artificial minds. Part 18. The Mechanism and the Machines. We return at the end to the question that was left open. Selection by consequences still needed a mechanism inside the brain. Why should a consequence change the organism that produced it? The popular answer points to dopamine, the so-called pleasure chemical. A reward arrives, dopamine surges, and the pleasure stamps in the act. This picture is clean and intuitive, and almost entirely wrong. The truth came from recording single dopamine neurons in monkeys. A monkey learns that a tone is followed by a drop of juice. Before learning, the juice itself triggers a burst of dopamine. That fits the pleasure story perfectly, at least at first. But after learning, the burst quietly moves backward in time. Now the tone triggers the dopamine, and the juice triggers nothing. The reward itself, once expected, produces no signal at all. Then comes the detail that breaks the pleasure story completely. Let the tone play, but then withhold the expected juice. At the moment the juice was due, the neurons dip below baseline. They fire less than usual, sending a clear negative signal. So dopamine is not reporting pleasure, or even reward itself. It reports the gap between the reward you expected and got. Surprise drives the signal. A fully expected reward teaches nothing. This signal has a precise name, the reward prediction error. And here the whole story takes its most remarkable turn. Computer scientists had described this exact signal more than a decade earlier. They had built it to make machines learn from their own rewards. Their algorithm learns by computing the error in its predictions. The brain, it turned out, had been running the same algorithm. This is the mechanism that the selection account had been missing. Reinforcement in the brain is learning driven by prediction error. The stamping in that Thorndike imagined is error correction in circuits. And notice what this does to Skinner's old, stubborn definition. He refused to define a reinforcer by pleasure, only by effect. The brain agrees in a way he could not have known. A fully expected reward feels good, yet reinforces nothing at all. What teaches the brain is not the pleasure, but the surprise. This insight was not entirely without warning in the older work. Studying simple conditioning, two researchers had reached a similar conclusion. An animal learns from a pairing only when the outcome surprises it. If a second signal adds nothing new, no learning occurs. Surprise, not mere closeness in time, was already the key. The same principle now powers the most striking machines we build. A program taught itself to play backgammon at master level. Another learned arcade games from raw pixels with no instructions. Others mastered Go and chess by playing themselves millions of times. Each one learns complex behavior purely by chasing and maximizing reward. This is operant conditioning, formalized and scaled beyond any animal. And the fluent language models from earlier close the circle. After they learn to predict words, they are tuned by reward. Human raters approve some of their answers and reject others. Those judgments become a reward that selects the model's speech. The verbal behavior is shaped by its consequences, response by response. It is shaping the method from the flour mill run on a machine. The language that reopened the Chomsky debate is itself reinforced speech. Honesty requires one more careful turn before we reach a verdict. The prediction error story is a triumph, but not the whole truth. Recent work shows dopamine encodes a whole range of possible rewards, not a single average, but a full spread of outcomes. That richer idea came, once again, straight from artificial intelligence. The influence now flows both ways, between brains and machines. The convergence is real, and its fine detail is still being written. So, after 18 turns, what is the verdict on the man? Start with what he got right, because it is a great deal. Behavior is shaped by its consequences. That core claim has held. It is now written in dopamine and in the engines of machines. His refusal to define reward by pleasure was vindicated exactly, and his selection idea unified life, learning, and now intelligence itself. Now the other side of the ledger, which is also large. His strict ban on inner states was simply far too severe. The inside turned out to be real and knowable and necessary. Prediction, value, and expectation are exactly the inner machinery he forbade. His account of language badly underrated its astonishing structure, and his leap from the lab to redesigning society overreached. The question of who controls and toward what he never solved. Underneath both of those columns lies one striking and final irony. Skinner insisted the inside did not matter to his science. He lost that fight, and the mind came flooding back. Yet when the inside was finally opened and read, this is what it held. Learning by consequences, the very principle he had spent his life on. He was wrong about the method and right about the mechanism. The man who tried to discard the mind described the engine inside it. Return at the very last to where we began this journey. Your hand reached for your phone, and it felt like choice. Skinner said the cause lay outside you in a history of consequences. That history is no longer a slogan or a mere hunch. It is legible now in the firing of cells and the training of machines. Whether that leaves any room for the author you feel yourself to be. That is the question Skinner forces, and it is still yours to answer.